Hello everyone, and welcome to a presentation that gives an overview of some changes to aged care policy in Australia for students of Action Learning Studies. I intend this as an introduction, not a complete overview. In beginning, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, their leaders and elders both past and present, the traditional custodians upon whose lands La Trobe University, Melbourne and City campuses are situated, and also to the traditional custodians upon whose lands you may be listening to this presentation. These slides are mostly the work of Professor Yvonne Wells of the Lincoln Institute Centre for Research on Ageing, who has very kindly permitted me to use them. Much of the commentary is also hers, but I'll also endeavour to differentiate my own thoughts during the presentation. I provide some commentary from the perspective of a person who has had to use the system recently on behalf of my father. I like to think that I'm an experienced person in the health system, but I have to be honest and say that nothing prepared me for the bureaucracy and difficulty in navigating the current aged care system. But first, some words about the original author. Professor Wells is a clinical psychologist by training, but has a research career since completing her PhD in 1994. Her main research areas include transition in later life, healthy ageing, community aged care services and residential aged care. And she has a long-standing interest in caregiving, especially for people living with dementia. The Lincoln Centre for Research on Ageing conducts research and consultancy activity in these areas. Professor Wells has been a convener of the Victorian branch of the Psychology and Ageing Interest Group of the Australian Psychological Society since 2001. She was awarded Distinguished Membership of the Australian Association of Gerontology in 2012. She currently serves on the editorial committee of the Australasian Journal of Ageing as the book review editor. I'm very grateful for her support and input into our course. So what has happened to aged care in Australia? Well, these slides explain what has been happening in Australia over the past few years, including the release of the government's policy for aged care. This was a major review of our health and hospital system, which released a report back in 2009. Following this report, a productivity commission was asked to review aged care in Australia. This report was released in 2011. Since then, the government has conducted a series of consultations with the community and released their new policy, which is called Living Longer, Living Better. This, in turn, has led to a wholesale redesign of the aged care sector. Now, I've had personal experiences as a nurse working agency shifts in the nursing homes in the late 1980s. And having just admitted my elderly parent into a nursing home, I am completely astonished by the changes. But let's look at why the changes occurred. And this particular slide is not Professor Wells' work, but rather my own reflection of my experience working in these homes in the late 1980s. My first exposure to nursing homes was in 1970 at the age of 9, visiting my paternal grandmother. My twin sister and I were horrified, but knew that we had to keep our mouths shut because in those days children were to be seen and not heard. Nursing homes for the aged were awful places to live. They were often converted from larger, older houses with as many beds as possible crammed into the available rooms and as many as 4 beds crammed into what we would now consider adequate space for one person to live. Precious few had private rooms and private bathrooms were almost unknown. Above all, they were run for profit. These nursing homes were often terribly cold to reduce the cost of heating in winter and often unbearably hot in summer. There was little privacy at all. The homes were designed for military efficiency and to minimise costs. Food was terrible, often there was no choice. One thing was on the menu and if you didn't like it, well, that was your problem. What food there was often in short supply, and sadly malnutrition was common and, to be honest, some people slowly starved to death. The routine was predicated on making life easier for staff because they were chronically short-staffed, and in fact the homes were run rather like acute hospital wards. It was not uncommon for night duty staff to start showering residents very early in the morning, such as 4 or 5 in the morning, to lighten the load on the morning shift staff. I can recall working in a 24-bed nursing home, long since closed, in 1985, when we each had 12 residents to look after, to bathe and shower, toilet and feed. They were all in 3 or 4 bed rooms. There was absolutely no time to provide any personalised care other than the basic necessities of life. Clearly, something needed to change. Now, historically, in Australia, the aged care system has operated separately from the healthcare system. When we talk about the aged care system, we mean the supports that are specific to older people. The healthcare system provides older people with care from doctors, hospitals and community centres. However, this care is provided to everyone regardless of age. The first point about aged care is that most care and support for older people is provided by their family, friends and neighbours. Of those older Australians receiving assistance in the community, about 80% of them receive it from informal carers. Government subsidised services are provided to over 1 million older Australians and their carers each year currently. More than half receive low intensity support through the Home and Community Care, or the HAC system, or program, which is the basic care tier. Then there are community care packages and residential care places for people with higher levels of need. The National Health and Hospitals Reform Commission was established by the federal government in 2007 to develop a long-term health reform plan for modern Australia. In their 2009 report, the Commission devoted a whole chapter to issues with aged care. The report said that there would be a huge growth in demand for aged care services because of the ageing population. In addition, disease patterns in Australia have been changing, with a shift to chronic rather than acute conditions. Dementia is a particular concern. Also, with changes in the demographics of Australia, with smaller families and more women in the workforce, older people will have reduced access to family support. The report also identified some directions for change that was needed in aged care. In particular, it was thought that aged care services need to become more responsive to the needs of older people and their families, to be better connected with health services, and to fund people and their needs rather than beds or places. Now you might ask, well, what is the Productivity Commission? Well, it was an independent research and advisory body which advised the Australian Government on a range of economic, social and environmental issues affecting the welfare of Australians. The role was to help governments make better policies in the long-term interest of the whole Australian community. It's an example of evidence-based change or policy decision-making. With respect to aged care, the Productivity Commission was asked to develop detailed options for redesigning Australia's aged care system to ensure that it could meet the challenges facing it in coming decades. The Productivity Commission held rounds of consultations all over Australia and invited submissions from aged care providers, researchers and groups of older people. The draft report was written and further feedback was invited, and the Commission finally released its final report in 2011. The Productivity Commission reiterated the message that increasing numbers of older people will pose a challenge to the current aged care system. However, its analysis indicated that older people will not just become more numerous, but also more diverse in terms of ethnicity and lifestyle. 35% of older Australians were born in other countries, and of these, nearly 2/3 were born in countries where English is not the first language. As well as the fall in number of informal or family carers, having a large enough paid workforce will be a challenge, and we will need to use new technologies to support the health and well-being of older people. Now, an interesting point about this graph on the right of this slide is the proportion of Australian Indigenous people. It's almost invisible down the bottom near the 0%. This is a sober reminder of the reality for our Indigenous brothers and sisters. They represent a tiny proportion of the aged care sector at the moment. And the sad and terrible reason is that, on average, our Indigenous brothers and sisters don't live as long as the rest of our society. I covered this in another lecture on the Australian healthcare system. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. The Productivity did identify some key strengths in the current system. The current aged system has some strengths. There are some improvements over the past decades in the range and quality of support services available to older people, and in the standards of quality and safety in these areas. The workforce is generally highly dedicated to caring and appropriately skilled. However, a direct quote from the report said that older Australians told the Commission that they did not want to be passive recipients of services dependent on funded providers. Rather, people want to be independent and able to choose where they live, which provider they will use, and the way in which services are delivered, and whether they are able to purchase additional service and/or a higher standard of accommodation. In addition, there were some weaknesses in the system as it stood at the time. It's difficult for people to understand and navigate. It's also difficult to find out about how to access services. Services were limited. There were not enough to meet the demand. There was limited choice, and there were inconsistencies in quality in the degree to which people's needs are met and in their financial arrangements associated with it. Workforce shortages are exacerbated by low wages in comparison with wages of acute hospitals, particularly with respect to nursing staff. And in addition, there were some workers who had insufficient skills for the job they were being asked to do. The Productivity Commission made a comprehensive range of recommendations. They covered issues about how services could be funded, the nature of care and support, catering for diversity, housing, looking after family carers and volunteers, workforce issues, research and evaluation, and together with an implementation timetable. Perhaps the most important issue was that the recommendation that services be entitlement-based rather than according to quotas. Previously, the government allocated a certain number of places per 1,000 people in the population aged over 70. This meant that there were often long waiting lists for some services. They also recommended a single gateway with regional outlets, which would provide information, conduct simple assessments of functional capability or capacity of people requiring services, their eligibility for services, and capacity to pay, and this would then go on to coordinate referrals to services supported by a system of electronic records and communication. And the government then set about having conversations all around Australia, facilitated by the Council on Ageing. The picture in this slide is a picture of the then Minister, Mark Butler, at one of these conversations. Now, the main messages from the conversations were that older people want high quality services and supports to be available when and where they need them. Older people prefer to be supported at home and would consider moving to residential care only when staying at home is no longer possible. They would like a simplified and streamlined way to access information on a range of issues, including healthy ageing, aged care services, and the quality of these services. Older Australians want to be able to obtain services in a seamless way. They want to experience services as consistent and coherent. And finally, older Australians want to improve the experience of dying. They want to have as much control as possible and have access to palliative care services at home, preferably, rather than having to go to hospital. Now, palliative care services include the control of pain and other symptoms of illness with support for the family and also incorporating spiritual care. In 2012, the government released its policy response to these recommendations called Living Longer, Living Better. The policy response incorporates some, but not all, of the Productivity Commission's recommendations and most of the concerns expressed in the conversations conducted by the Minister. The government recognised the need to improve the support for older people to stay at home and restructured the services to incorporate several existing services at the basic level. At the packaged care level, the government increased the number of levels of entitlement from 2 to 4 levels. The nature of care provided has changed and all new packages incorporate the principles of consumer-directed care. This means it puts the older person and their carers at the centre of the care provision. Consumer-directed care allows people to have greater control over their own lives by allowing them, to the extent that they are able and wish to do so, to make choices about the types of care services they access and the delivery of those services, including who will deliver the services and when. The government allocates funds to carers to help them access respite and counselling services. Respite care is short-term temporary relief to those who are caring for family members. Respite may be provided in the people's homes, in daycare centres or in residential care settings. Perhaps the most profound change has been in residential care. A policy of ageing in place has been developed so that people have the choice of moving into a new place of residence when they need to, that can provide ageing in place, including the meeting of escalated care needs as a person ages. This may include palliative or end-of-life care. An example of this is Vasey RSL Care, a merger of Vasey Housing, an organisation that was established to assist war widows after the Second World War, and RSL Care, who actually met the needs of veterans. These merged organisations had 3 separate sites in southern metropolitan Melbourne, consisting of a splendid and really ahead of its time hostel built in the late 1970s called Waratah Lodge in Sandringham, as well as a nursing home in Rumballara in Brighton. Of course, they had numerous other sites all across the nation, but I just want to concentrate on these two sites. The difference was stark between the two services. The hostel was rather homely. Each person had their own private room without an ensuite, but the nursing home was almost like a hospital ward. If a person needed additional care, they were transferred from the hospital to the nursing home. Now, after the merger of these two organisations into the one, they looked at their care provision, and they replaced the two facilities of Waratah Lodge and Rumballara with a single purpose-built facility. Again, this was rather ahead of its time. This was called Vasey RSL Care Brighton East. And this is where my father has recently been admitted. Each resident has their own private bedroom and living area. Each bedroom has its own bathroom, which is an ensuite bathroom, which includes a toilet and a shower. It's like a wet room. There's a communal or dining area where people can have their meals, although they can have them in their own rooms if they prefer. And there's also a communal lounge area. In addition to, there are 4 separate, if you like, neighbourhoods within the unit itself, or the entire service. So they split things up so that people live in smaller groups according to the care needs. But getting back to the policy, physical facilities are not enough. It is the staff that really makes a difference in either residential aged care or in domiciliary aged care. Traditionally, aged care has been a sector where staff are poorly remunerated and was once the province of nursing and nurses. A greater awareness, particularly since the 1980s, has been the need for assistance with personal care rather than nursing care per se. Training and development of the sector has slowly progressed, but is still heavily influenced by the medical models of hospitals and the hierarchy associated with that. So the need for evidence is important. So research and evaluation is really, really important. We need to have research that is focused on client needs, that is the outcomes of which should be easily able to be implemented and integrated into the care. And we also need to have periodic review to ensure relevance. The connections between aged care services and healthcare services have been improved, and new technologies such as telehealth will be supported in the years to come. Telehealth is the delivery of healthcare-related services and information via telecommunications technologies. In Australia, telehealth is particularly important in regional and remote areas. However, it can be used to support older people living at home by helping them to monitor basic vital signs like blood pressure, weight, pulse and blood sugar values. And in fact, my father took part in a trial sponsored by the Department of Veterans Affairs for over 2 years with a telemonitoring unit in his home a couple of years ago. The care and support of people with dementia is also a high priority. We also already have a Dementia Behaviour Improvement Manager and Advisory Service. This service is a free Australian government-funded dementia care program and is designed to ease the burden for both aged care staff and family carers, and to improve the quality of life for people living with dementia whose behaviours are impacting on their care. The Dementia Supplement is a financial payment that will help people with dementia in both residential and community care settings. The government has also recognised that there are people in special groups that may need particular assistance. Such groups include people from a range of cultural backgrounds, those who are Indigenous, especially those living in remote areas of Australia, and people who have experienced discrimination in lives because of things like their sexual orientation, and those who have previously been homeless or at risk of homelessness. Sadly, in Australia, we're seeing a trend of older people who are no longer able to afford the rents that are rising, particularly in metropolitan areas, and have lived in their houses or their places for many years and are now finding it impossible to afford that. In response to this, the government has implemented a gateway service, although perhaps not in the way that the Productivity Commission envisaged. The My Aged Care website provides information on services and service quality. The website publishes a rating system of aged care homes so that people can make the most informed choice about their care by comparing services in their area. There is also a national call centre that people can contact. It is the main entry point into the aged care system and is intended to provide a comprehensive system of information to enable Australians to find the information they need. Older Australians with complex health and aged care needs will be better linked to care and services in the community. The linking services tried to help people with multiple needs access services in their local communities, and this may include referrals to health, housing, disability services and financial advice, as well as aged care services. Now, my recent 2018 experience is that these services fall well short of the intended expectations. The site takes a great deal of time to navigate and, to be honest, is very confusing to a person unfamiliar with the sector. I found it very difficult to find the information needed, and often I was referred to another page or another service, which in turn referred me back to the aged care service site. Clearly, improvement is needed. But perhaps one of the positive outcomes of the whole issue is that the realisation that we should encourage people to live as independently for as long as possible, rather than, as my parents did to their elderly relatives, move people into care homes just in case. So there's a need to continue to reduce age discrimination in communities so that older people can continue to participate in the community in a range of ways, for example by staying in the workforce if they choose, or take up opportunities for lifelong learning, and to contribute to the community through volunteering and other activities. Now, the response to the government's policy change in the early part of this decade was, in the words of Ian Yates from the Council of Ageing, it was an excellent beginning. However, implementation of government policy is always problematic. There have been issues and disagreements about funding, with money being transferred from some services to pay for others, and this always leads to conflict. But one positive aspect, in my opinion, is that the federal government now manages community aged care, rather than being split across 8 different state or territory government responsibilities. Home care packages now have introduced personal budgets. The clients choose what they spend their allocated funds on. The intent is to focus towards reablement, and not just in Victoria and Western Australia, where it was already standard practice. And it now incorporates a short-term restorative care service. All requests for services and assessments for eligibility are now handled through the My Aged Care website. And the Australian Aged Care Quality Agency audits residential care and has introduced a consumer experience report which rates residential care home on 10 criteria. And these reports are published online to improve consumer choice. This is an example of how it's presented in the Aged Care Quality Agency. The web page looks like this. And the survey questions, they have a number of standard questions which they ask the people living in the homes to respond. Do staff treat you with respect? Do you feel safe here? Do they meet your healthcare needs? Do their staff follow up when you raise things with them? Do they explain things to you? Whether you like the food there, if you're feeling sad or worried, are there staff there to whom you can talk? Whether you have confidence in what the staff are doing, whether in the opinion of the consumers, whether the place is well run, and whether you're encouraged to do as much as possible for yourself. And these are reported in terms of quality care reports, as well as audit outcomes. And here is some examples of the results which I looked at when I was looking for an aged care home for my father with Vasey Brighton East. So what are the things we still need to know? And this is perhaps an opportunity if you're still looking for an ALS project, is that we still often lack evidence to support new interventions and programs. And yes, there are continuing workforce issues. What is the best training that we should be looking at for providing our workforce? And how can those skills of personal care workers be improved so that we still have issues with quality in residential care? And we always will, because this is an ongoing issue. In any case, I'd like to say thank you for staying with me for the length of this presentation. And before I finish, I'd like to note my appreciation to Professor Yvonne Wells. If you are looking for an ALS project, this is perhaps a rich area for you to consider, because as ever, aged care homes are always looking for ways to improve, and they may be looking for people to do projects. So this might be something well worth you considering exploring. Happy to chat with you at any time. Give me a call. Look forward to speaking to you. See you soon. Adam Ferrier signing off.